Hey everybody, welcome to CAF Warbird Tube, the show where we talk about World War II, aviation, history, and so much more. Warbird Tube is produced by the Commemorative Air Force, the world's largest flying museum. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and honor through flight and living history experiences. The CAF began the Warbird movement more than 65 years ago, and thanks to the support of individuals like you, we continue to grow strong. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and now our host, Steve Buss. Thanks for watching and keep 'em flying.
Good evening. Welcome everyone. This is episode 116 of Warbird Tube, and tonight we have an update on the P-47 restoration project from our friends at Airbase Georgia. But before we get started, please do us a favor. If you haven't already done so, take a second to like, share, or subscribe and follow us. And if you do subscribe on YouTube, click that bell icon and you'll get notifications about new episodes of Warbird Tube when they are posted. Now, as you're watching tonight, you'll probably have some questions. As always, just type them in the comments section. We'll try to answer them either during the presentation or before we sign off. Now, before we dive into the current restoration of the P-47, CAF historian Brad Pilgrim is joining us to provide a little background on this P-47 and the P-47s that have been part of the CAF.
Good to be here, Steve. Good to see you again. Good to have the opportunity to do this.
Knowing that you know quite a bit about CAF's past, let's talk about the P-47s that were part of the CAF, maybe officially and unofficially, and really where did they come from?
Well, the majority of the P-47s that people assume belong to the CAF never did. There were 6 Peruvian P-47s that a man named Ed Juris recovered, and they came to the CAF. And they were put together. They weren't restored. They were literally just put back together and kind of had IRANs, inspect repairs necessary. And that's where the famous picture of the 6 P-47s flying together with all guys wearing gray uniforms and everything like that. But those airplanes didn't actually belong to us. We operated them for several years for Ed Juris while he tried to sell them as a group. The CF tried to buy the entire group on more than one occasion and just wasn't able to swing it. And eventually, Ed, being a businessman, he wasn't in the airplane business. He was in old cars, is basically what he was doing. So he had to sell the airplanes in order to recoup his investment. Dave Talashe got them. They went all over the country and are split up now. The only P-47 that the CF ever really actually owned is the one we have today that's in Georgia now. And it was not in that picture with the 6 P-47s. It wasn't even flyable at the time. In fact, it never appeared with any of the other P-47s in a picture, certainly not when they were flying. By the time the airplane was flyable again, the other P-47s had been sunk. So we own this P-47N that we have, and then we had basically 1.5 wrecked P-47Ns that we collected up over the years and used for spare parts.
So you said they came from Peru. Now, they were used in the Peruvian Air Force before coming here. And were they sold surplus from the U.S. to the Peru?
Yes, they were sold surplus. And just like with our P-47 that wound up in Nicaragua and in Guatemala, a lot of airplanes back then, a lot of the Latin American, South American countries that were very, very anti-communist, they found themselves on the receiving end of American benevolence when it came to military stuff. And Peru was one of those places. And so we wouldn't give them jets. Part of it was they didn't have the ability to operate them, didn't have the infrastructure. They were certainly capable, but they didn't have the infrastructure. So we gave them all these surplus airplanes that, quite honestly, we didn't need anymore. And if they got down there and got torn up, no one cared. And by this time, we're flying jets in the U.S., so we weren't worried about them invading or anything. And so that's where our old surplus stuff went. And as the years went by, in fact, the reason this P-47 wound up with us is because eventually the Guatemalans and Nicaraguans became deserving in the Americans' eyes of having jets. And so we started giving them jets, so they started selling all these airplanes. The vast majority of airplanes, Mustangs, P-63s, some P-38s, most of the surviving P-47s, all came from Latin America because of the military assistance program and America's total hatred of communism and Fidel Castro in particular. So they would help us against Castro, we would help arm them in a way that benefited us.
the airplanes that ended up in South America. You mentioned Mustangs, and the P-47, of course, leads to the Soccer War, the only recorded mission of P-51s against P-47.
Yeah, the Soccer Wars Corsair.
And that could be a show on itself.
Later on,
Corsairs.
Later on, not later on, but earlier than that, when the Guatemalans had their revolution, there was P-47s used against P-51s, and our P-47, if the story is accurate, which I think it's about 99% accurate, it shot down a Mustang. And so our P-47, in theory at least, was the last Thunderbolt to have an aerial kill. Can't ever prove it, but why lie about something like that?
That's right. The story's
exactly.
Good. So what's the genesis of this P-47 that we're going to take a look at tonight?
This P-47 was built, it's an N model, which is the long-range version, which is intended for being a B-29 escort in the Pacific War. The D model is the standard bubble-top Mustang that most people think of. There's other variants, but generally that's what you think of. The N model, this slightly longer wings, has fuel tanks in the leading edges of the wings and had autopilot. The rudder pedals folded over backwards, and they were padded on the back so the pilot could stretch out in there, had much better radios and stuff like that. And the intent was it was a long-range escort across the Pacific from Ieshima Island, right there by Okinawa, to Japan. That was the whole intent of it. And because the war didn't really last that long, flying from Tinian and places like that, the Mustangs came in and kind of took over that duty. But the Thunderbolts did it, and then a lot of them went to like the Puerto Rican Air National Guard, which was American territory, and so we let them use some of the airplanes. But this particular airplane was built in July of '45, obviously the same month as Fifi. And obviously it didn't go into combat, and it wound up going to the Puerto Rican Air National Guard. In about 1954 or so about 9 years later, there were 6 P-47s that were loaned to the CIA, and then the CIA loaned them to Nicaragua. And, Somoza was the president of Nicaragua, the dictator of Nicaragua, whatever you wanted to call him, and he was very, very, very anti-Castro. And he was mostly anti-Castro because it benefited him to be anti-Castro as far as getting help from America. And they loaned the airplanes to the Guatemalans to use in their revolution, which had been going on for many, many years prior to this. And then the Guatemalan Revolution had happened. This P-47 flew combat missions in that. A man named Jerry DeLarme was a mercenary pilot. He was a CIA guy who became a mercenary pilot. And he was primarily the guy who flew the airplane. And it was kind of his plane. It was taken better care of than the other 5 P-47s. Through attrition and lack of parts and things like that, they started disappearing. It ended up back in Nicaragua finally, where it started. It was given back to the Nicaraguans. It was theirs anyway, but it was traded for a Swedish Mustang. And so by this time, Guatemala was starting to re-equip the Mustangs. So Nicaragua got their Thunderbolts back, and it stayed there flying in the Costa Rican invasion that they did. And there was you never think about little, they call them banana republics and stuff like that down in Latin America. And I always thought that was probably a derogatory name, but it's really not, because a lot of their economy is over fruit. And there's the United Fruit Company. And Alan Dulles, who was the director of the CIA during the Bay of Pigs, he was on the board of United Fruit, and several other people of Eisenhower's administration were related to United Fruit. But United Fruit was pushing the Guatemalan Revolution because it benefited them. And it's Chiquita Banana today is who this company is. But I don't want to say that fruit in these banana republics funded these revolutions, but they did. And it was, I can't remember what the name of the PB Success, Operation PB Success, was about this revolution by United Fruit, or funded by United Fruit. And it was an amazing amount of money that went into buying these airplanes and maintaining these airplanes so that they could get the government installed that benefited the fruit people. So that's where the term banana republics came from. But anyway, this Thunderbolt was there, and then in 1962, the government started getting jets. And so the Nicaraguan government, they started getting jets because they had been helpful to the U.S., and they put them all up for sale. And there was some Mustangs and a bunch of other stuff. The CAF already had a Mustang. They didn't have a Thunderbolt at this point. The Peruvian ones had not been recovered. In fact, I don't really think anyone had thought about the Peruvian ones at this point. And so what they did was C.W. Butler and Lloyd Nolan, who were two of the original founding members, the Founding Five, and then Dick Disney, all went down to Managua, Nicaragua, and looked at this airplane. And what Lloyd always said was it was the one that was leaking the least oil and leaking the least hydraulic fluid, but was in so much better shape than the others. And they went around and said, one of the local military pilots, we need you to come test fly the airplane, and none of them would do it. And they said they didn't think it was because of a mechanical condition; they just couldn't get them to come fly it. And so this man came literally stepping out of the jungle one day and said, "I'll fly it for you." And he got in it and took off and did this whole air show over the field and all this kind of stuff, and came back, got out of the airplane and walked away. Well, that was Jerry Delarme, the guy who I was talking about earlier, who's the mercenary pilot. And they think that the airplane was maintained so well because it was his personal work. So the CF bought the airplane for a whopping $11,000, which the last Thunderbolt that sold, I think, went for a little over $8 million. So that's a pretty good investment. And then in 1963, Dick Disney went back down to Managua, got the airplane running, and I was already running, but got in it and flew it nonstop from Managua, Nicaragua to Brownsville, Texas, cleared customs, and then flew it into Mercedes. And at that time, it was still basically in Guatemalan colors. That's how we wound up with the airplane. And of course, back then, excuse me, it was registered to Thunderbolt and Company, which is how things were registered back then. And one of the things that I have is the bill of sale for the airplane, where it's registered to Thunderbolt and Company. Well, they went ahead and did the first annual and got it, registered in the U.S. on the N registry and everything like that. And at the time, it had 299.1 hours, according to the military logs. That's what the military logs said it had. And in 1971, Dick Disney was flying it. They were down in Vero Beach, Florida, which is where the airplane stayed most of the time, was in Florida. Dick Disney was flying it, and the carburetor quit on him. The carburetor just came apart. And he landed short out in the parking lot of the airport and hit a tree stump, according to some, a concrete culvert, according to others. But either way, it tore the left wing off of the airplane. It didn't tear it completely off. It really destroyed the left wing. They pulled the airplane back on there, and a man named Tom Holman was a Cadillac dealer down there. And Tom, as far as I can tell, Tom was never never in the military, at least not as a pilot. But Tom had been looking for a P-47 and had tried to buy some of these for the Guatemalans. But a guy named Dick Martin had gotten there first, or Will Martin. He had gotten there first and bought the rest of them. So Tom Holman sponsored the CAF Thunderbolt with the hopes that he would get to operate it. So he'd been doing that since 1969. So in 1971, when it crashed, it fell on Tom Holman to get the airplane running again. He had acquired another Thunderbolt project at this part, which is one of the other ones the CF ended up with. It was very much a partial airplane. It had landed, coming from Nicaragua with a different owner, it had landed in the water in Mexico after an engine failure, right on the beach, and got covered in salt water and all that. About the only thing they were able to save was a few cylinders and the left wing. The fuselage still exists today. I saw it not long ago. It's up north. So they replaced the left wing on it and did the first real in-depth American maintenance the airplane had probably since it was built. It was re-annualed on August 30th of 1975, and a man named Paul Bond took over as the chief pilot of the airplane. And he did the test flight on May 1st of 76. And at that time, the airplane had 316 hours on it. So we had only put 17 hours on the airplane in that amount of time. That's when it got painted silver the very first time. Prior to that, it was silver when it showed up. Then it got painted in the CF house colors, red, white, and blue. And then it had been kind of oversprayed silver when the accident happened. Then when the wing was replaced and all the work was done with the airplane, they painted it completely silver. And it flew all the way up until 1979 or so with just that silver paint on it. And then that's when they had the blue band put around the nose, which a lot of people have seen pictures of that from the 80s and early 90s with just a blue band around the nose. That was the colors of the Thunderbolts that flew off of Ieshima doing these long-range escort missions. The plane flew in 1984. A guy named Turk Moore, who was a flight surgeon down there, a retired military guy. He had the right landing gear collapsed on rollout. The prop hit the ground, tore up the engine, and all that kind of stuff. And it had 517 hours on it. And for some reason, and I cannot figure out why, for some reason, when the accident happened and the engine was pulled off in 1984, between there and 1986, when the new engine was put back on it, so a year and a half or so that it didn't fly, for some reason, 174 hours were added to the airplane's logbook. Now, I don't know why, because that's also when the hour meter was installed in the airplane. So maybe they found some military logs or something that showed it had 175 more hours than it did. I don't know. But I thought that was weird. One of the things I have here is the original logbook from 1963 when the CF first got it, and you can see where the hours are added, 174 hours. So, 1987, it was assigned to Ed Messick, and he flew it around quite a bit. And then in 1988, down in Harlingen, the airplane had kind of fallen into disrepair. By this point, Ed Messick really wasn't involved with the CF anymore at this point, because he was the guy who had to land an accident in the P-82 and was supposed to pay for it and never did, so Ed really wasn't involved. I don't even know. He might not have even been alive still at this point. I don't remember. But they started the Thunderbolt Squadron. And John Luther, Claire Potter, Linda Finch, and one or two other people assumed sponsorship of the airplane and put a new engine on it. Then shortly after that is when it got painted in that horrible blue camouflage, two-tone blue camouflage, which is accurate, but it is just uglier than a mud fence dipped in tar. And I always thought it was ugly. It was ugly original. It was ugly in 1988. But a man named John Luther and then Linda Finch, they flew it for the most part. And then it wound up going to, Lad Doctor became involved, and then he got Jim Cavanaugh involved from the Cavanaugh Flight Museum up there in Addison. And so then Aubrey Hare became a sponsor of it, and then Cavanaugh took the entire airplane. It came over to the museum, and they put a whole lot of work into it. I mean, they probably put as much work into that airplane as it had in 30 years. And then it took a lot of infighting from one unit to the other, because the old Thunderbolt Squadron decided once Cavanaugh had the airplane finished, then it should go back to headquarters to go on display. And then they were going to take it to Tulsa, and the Cavanaugh guys who had put all this money in and all the sponsors were from there, they were just going to lose the airplane. So it ended up coming to Cavanaugh and staying there. And they started flying it in 1998. In October of 2000, during a standard run-up on taxi, one of the brakes locked up and flipped the airplane up on its nose and bent the propeller, and they had to pull the engine off. The engine went out to Precision to be overhauled up in Seattle. Then it came back, and then it got painted up in Little Meaty's Meat Chopper colors like it is painted today. Oscar Perdomo was the last base in the day flying P-47s in the Pacific, and I have some John Lane, who is a longtime CF member. He lives up in Idaho, restores the Corsairs and Thunderbolts. Corsairs and TBMs. John used to fly Thunderbolt and all that. He knew Oscar Perdomo real well after the war, and they lived in Arizona. And John has some very interesting tales. The man was a fighter pilot to the end, I guess is the easiest way to say it. He was a very interesting guy, and John had some neat stories about him. But the airplane's painted in his colors today. Well, then, in 2002, it had the engine fire and crash landing in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which caused it to, it really, really got damaged. Doug James, who was flying the airplane, the number 10 cylinder, the exhaust popped off of it and melted through a bunch of oil lines and all that. And that's how the fire started. But Doug got the airplane back on the ground, barely, but he saved the airplane in the end. But Doug got burned. His face shield on his helmet was starting to melt. The canopy on the airplane was starting to melt and sag. But he managed to get it on the ground, but he landed so hard that the entire right wing broke off the airplane. And so now he's got a right wing off of another Thunderbolt project that the CF bought back in the 70s. that was never complete. So now we have the original fuselage, most with the new left wing off of another Thunderbolt back in 79, and then a right wing now off of another Thunderbolt. So now you got two end-model wings on an end-model fuselage with none of them doing. But we had it at Kavanaugh for a long time. After the accident, it was at the Kavanaugh Museum, and a lot of work got done on it. RB Aero Company up in Sherman, Texas, reskinned the fuselage, did a lot of work on the wings, did a whole lot to the airplane, and eventually the insurance money ran out. I guess some of the sponsors just kind of lost interest in continuing to fund something that was becoming a bottomless pit. And every time they got closer to getting it finished, another unit was trying to take it from them. So they finally just decided to give the airplane back. And when I worked at Kavanaugh, that was one of the, well, actually, I didn't even work at Kavanaugh. I was still working for the B-29 squadron at the time. I found an individual in the squadron who was going to sponsor getting the P-47 back from Kavanaugh, bringing it over to headquarters in Dallas. And so we went over and picked it up and had it trucked over by Buddy Chapman. And it sat in Dallas just for a little while, but it sure looked neat sitting there in pieces in the hangar. And it did have a lot of work done on it. I mean, it looked pretty nice. And then SoCal Wing ended up getting it. And they took what we had there in Dallas, and then they came over to Addison. By then I was working for Kavanaugh. They came over there, and we gathered up rest of the parts. They containerized them and everything. And it all wound up in SoCal. They had it for a few years, and now it's in Georgia, at the Georgia unit now. I'm sorry, I don't know the name, Dixie Wing, whatever you call it now. It's there now, Airbase Georgia. And they're going to work on it. They're doing more work on it. There's been more work done on it now than has been in the last 15 years. And if anybody has the ability to put it back together and make a nice flying airplane, it's going to be Dixie Wing. And I genuinely hope that they leave it in the Little Meaties Meat Chopper colors, in Oscar Perdomo's colors. I hope they do that because, it does a couple of things. One, it's very colorful, and it has cool nose art, so it's a marketable airplane like that. It's unique in that it's an end-model Mustang, and honestly, there's just not that many, other than nose art being different, there's not that many wild, garish, attention-getting paint schemes for end-model Thunderbolts. And two, Oscar Perdomo was a Mexican-American. And so there was quite a few Mexican-Americans that were aces, but he has the distinction of being the last American ace in the day. And I think it's a pretty neat thing to have the airplane painted in his colors. And I hope they leave it that way. I think that's the current plan, but I'm not 100% sure. But that's kind of how the airplane wound up where it is.
Yeah, we haven't heard for sure what the final outcome of the nose art will be. I think they're a little more concerned about getting all the pieces put back together before they worry about paint schemes. But yeah, Brad, thank you for filling us in on the background on the P-47. And we're going to turn things over to the folks down in Airbase Georgia, talk a little bit about the flying characteristics of the P-47, and check in on the latest restoration. And look carefully, you'll see that new right wing. Randy Hawkins will walk us through some of the challenges they've had with that new wing.
Well, I gave them the old right wing not long ago, the one that broke off the airplane. We still had it at Kavanaugh long after the airplane left. And I gave it back. Mark Todd has it in his backyard in Dallas, going to take it down to Atlanta here pretty soon.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks, Brad. Have a good night.
Hi, I'm Stan Music from Airbase Georgia. We are honored to be able to provide a whole great experience to people who love warbirds. The Airbase Georgia has a Corsair, a Mustang, a P-63, a T-6, a PT under restoration, and a Stearman under restoration. And now we have a P-47. And we are quite honored to be able to put this together and return it to flying status. And we're going to go through today and tell you about some of the things and answer some questions that people have about the P-47. Okay, as my children and family say, I'm just an airplane addict. They talk to me all the time about, Dad, your airplane addiction. But I got my first airplane ride at age 12. That was the only airplane ride I had until I started taking lessons. I started lessons, and then I bought my first airplane when I was 17, got my license when I was 17, and 50 years ago this month, I soloed, which is amazing when you look at it that way. I fell in love with warbirds reading Gordon Baxter's column in Flying Magazine called Bax, B-A-X, Seat. And Gordon published a lot of good stuff, including a great book called Log of a Pasture Pilot. As soon as I could, I bought a Stearman and flew that for several hundred hours, and then I saw a T6. And the T6 absolutely enchanted me, and I still own one to this day. And then I started flying the CAF P-40. I ended up with a Hawker Sea Fury, a Mustang, and now today I'm honored to get to fly the CAF Mustang, and I've flown some others. But I have flown this P-47, this actual one, back before something happened to it, the P-40. I've flown the Hawker Sea Fury, the Corsair, and the Mustang. And they're phenomenal airplanes. I still fly some general aviation, some King Airs, Barons, other things of that nature, but the Warbirds, they're the ones that enchant you. I've flown this particular 47 about 5 hours. I flew it in Midland, Texas when it was based there, and then I ferried it to Dallas, and then when we turned it over to another museum. They ran it for a while, and then they had an unfortunate incident where it caught fire. Since that time, it has not been restored, and now we are getting ready to restore it to flight status again. To qualify in warbirds, we often say T6 time, the North American T6, the Texan, is the coin of the realm. The expression in World War II was, if you can fly a T6, son, you can fly anything. And there's a lot of truth to that. So what we look for in pilots is tail wheel time, total time, competency in retractable gear airplanes, situational awareness, and stick and rudder skills. We evaluate that in the T6, and then when guys get ready to move into fighters, we put them in the back seat, and we ask that they fly the T6 in the back seat and show us their skill from the back seat of the T6. It's very unforgiving from back there, and the visibility is fairly poor, and that's an excellent preparation to fly the heavier fighters of World War II. And with the Corsair, the big thing is visibility. You can't really see over, they call it the hose nose sometimes. It's got a big nose out there. And the Corsair, because of its design of its landing gear, can be tricky in crosswinds. It was originally designed to fly off carriers. The big advantage of a carrier is you can turn it into the wind. We have a hard time turning the runway into the wind here on the ground, but the Corsair is great. The Mustang is wonderful for its characteristics, and the P-47 is also wonderful for its characteristics. Jeff Ethel, who is since deceased, wrote a great book about warbirds, and in that he wrote, the P-47 is the only World War II fighter that has in its ops manual a statement that says the P-47 has no tendency to ground loop upon landing. And I would have to say that's true. It is very stable, it's got a very wide gear, and it is very straightforward. It's just wonderful. It's everything from the history. I know it sounds really silly, but when you sit in the Mustang on a beautiful day, a couple of days ago I gave a ride in the Mustang, and in the Mustang we sat there and it almost felt like you had the people from years past sitting on the wing with you, looking and watching and talking to you. Now, is that a little bit silly? Perhaps, but the history, the significance of the airplane, and thinking about the young men that went to war in the 40s with airplanes with low time, pulled them off the farms, taught them to fly, put them in airplanes that were extraordinarily high performance. So it's a very significant thing. It's also just a simple joy to fly because these are the ultimate performance in stick and rudder performance airplanes. You have to be able to feel the aircraft, you have to be able to see what it's going to do, and you have to be able to integrate that. As I tell the guys at test pilot school when we spend some time with them, the computer in the F-16 sort of tells you what you can and can't do. The computer in the Mustang is between your headset earpieces. That's the only computer you have. The P-47 is much heavier. It tends to track on the ground very smoothly, and when it develops speed, you know, we like to say gets up ahead of steam, it's very fast. A lot of the pilots that flew it in World War II simply loved it because it was so strong, so durable, it would take fire. And whereas the Mustang, for example, it's got a bunch of coolant and oil lines going back to radiators. You get one pinhole, you're going to be down on the ground in a few minutes because your coolant's going to run out. The P-47 was notorious for being able to absorb battle damage. So it was very good from that perspective. But it's heavy. It's not sprightly. It feels like you're flying an airborne heavy vehicle, and that's exactly what it's like. Well, the durability of it. And remember, these airplanes were designed to go to war. And so from that perspective, it was great. One of the downsides of the P-47 and any of the radial engine powered birds is their fuel consumption was higher for the performance than in the Mustang. The Mustang has a great, we use the phrase BSFC, basic specific fuel consumption, and that allows the Mustang to be more fuel efficient over long distances. But the P-47 was tremendous for diving and being able to build up a head of steam and dish out punishment, and that was one of its great characteristics. Fuel consumption would be a big one, and runway. You can get a Corsair on and off of less runway than you can a P-47. That's going to be up to the Airbase Georgia leadership. I certainly am open to that. The P-47 does these nice, big, beautiful loops and rolls, but it has a higher momentum. It has a much higher weight as it moves through the air, and it's going to be a much bigger, heavier aircraft. And we'll see what the leadership says at that time.
Now that we know more about the flying characteristics of the P-47, and this P-47 in particular, let's talk nuts and bolts about the actual restoration and get a status report from Airbase Georgia's maintenance officer, Randy Hawkins.
Hi, I'm Randy Hawkins with Airbase Georgia. I'm the maintenance officer currently, and we have our P-47 project on either side of me and around me and inside and out. And I want to show you where our hot job is right now on the airplane for part of this restoration. These are the wings. If you can see where we are, they're big. And this is the original left wing. Okay, it has some work to do, but not what the new old stock wing here has going on, and it's our job that we're tackling first. It's been a little bit of a challenge, but we are in the process of moving forward with it. So I want to show you where and what we got going on an intimate level. If you can walk back through here with me and not trip. Maybe a little dark. But in these areas, this is the wheel well cutout, and the wheel well itself, where the tire goes up with the landing gear in this section, and the brakes, everything else are on it, and it goes into here. Well, if you can see, this large piece of metal is where the wheel well doors would be. They have no structural value, they're just fairings. But the skin up here is supporting with the spars, and these things, which are stringers, which we have all detached right now, not riveted, are what carry the loads of the wing into the airplane. So we walk around this end. This is the upper side now, the upper skin. And where those stringers are is where these pair of fasteners or rivets are all running. There's a bunch of them. Now some of them are already in there and they were fine, but the ones that are removed were because they weren't primed when they were installed. They been sitting for I don't know how long, but they had corrosion through the verticals of the legs and the T's, and I'll show you that. And they were not permanently installed. They just had a couple tack rivets and some clecos, things that hold things together, like these things. All right, they're just there to lock things together. So to get the stringers out, you can't just take them out that way because they're one piece. So the rest of the skin has been unriveted so they can be slid out here, and you can see inside how they are, okay? All right, this is the gun bay where the machine guns are and the ammo bays. So now let's go back around here. Okay. So what we need to do is find these stringers, and they were really difficult. Air Corps finally came to our rescue. They had just finished a D model up there, and Eric Trudeau has been a godsend to help us with this stuff. And I finally got good manuals and good part numbers, but he knew the part number right off the top of his head. These stringers are new material, and they're replacing the old ones that were removed. And here you can see one of them with the corrosion. It's a hole just eating through it. And they also had been, and they had started installing them, they had patched holes. They had plugged them because they drilled wrong. They filled them up with a rivet, and then they drilled new holes. So anyway, we couldn't live with that. The other was the ends of these things are what's called a joggle. See that little bend? It's because the little bend is made to go and lay over like this, so everything lays flush up there on a former. Not this piece, but just so you get the idea. All right. With that said, we got the stringer material we needed that were blanks, and then we had to drill them. So we cut them to size. We actually made a joggle block tool that we used back in our machine shop, and they very nicely put the proper thing in by the drawing and worked just very cleverly, and didn't take long. Once we had that, we could put the blank in place without any holes in it, and then we could, once it's located, start drilling holes from the skin side back into the stringer this way and locking it in place with the clecos as we went. So all these have been drilled, deburred, and they are fitted and ready to go. They're covered in white epoxy primer. And now our problem is, again, little things you got to hunt for a project to keep it semi-realistic, is I need paint to match the internal paint on the wings. Everything on this airplane inside the fuselage, everything internal is painted this. And I think it was a zinc chromate yellow epoxy primer whenever they did it way back. It wasn't World War II stuff. The issue is everything we've done with the paint shops that we have local to produce the same color to make it disappear is off. And they're even using their photo digital machines and digital mixers and everything. And we've had several attempts. We got a little closer, but it's still not right. And a little closer, but still not right. So we're trying to get that, because we don't want to put the stringers back in and just have them stand out, because you can crawl into the airplane and air show and look up in the wheel and go, oh, they must be new. We want them all to blend in. So once we get these things painted, then we'll go and start riveting them in the airplane. And once we do that, that whole skin over there that I showed you will start going together. That'll be a massive project to get done. It won't take long, because we have several guys that did sheet metal work for the airlines for a living for years. And like myself, we had a lot of structures background. It doesn't look small, but it is if you already have the picture in your head. So it'll take them a good day and a half to shoot all that together. It's really straightforward. We've got all the hardware charts. We know what the materials types are. We have all that stuff readily available. Nothing there is out of the ordinary. Shooting rivets is not out of the ordinary if you know what you're doing and you got earplugs. And so it ought to be really good. Once we got that, then we can go ahead and move ahead with some of the other lesser jobs on that. But we need to get tied down on the smaller jobs and not get this big one just started, get that wing moving. As you can see, this wing doesn't need any of that. It's all together. These are all the same stringers in the left wing. All that's finished. That's all original factory stuff. But we have to go and put that stuff back together in the new old stock wing. So there we are with that. These are another part that we acquired, and we ended up getting 2 sets of brakes. These are what we understand by the part interface chart that tells us what can be used on different things from the military way back then. But these are a multi-segmented disc rotor and stator. Very similar that what is on the Corsairs, is on the Mustang, and the P-63, and I don't know what other airplanes at this point. But it's the same type of system they use on the big jets. They all use, but they are bigger, and they're a lot of them are carbon things. They're a lot lighter because these are really heavy. And it goes on the wheel. Goes on it actually. This mounts to the axle, to the landing gear with an adapter that's over there on the struts, and then hydraulics is fed in. And this thing right here is a backing plate, and inside there's an O-ring that's, we haven't seen this yet, it's probably as big around as my finger. But what it does, when you apply pressure with the brake master cylinders, fluid goes in this whole channel that these O-rings, this one big O-ring is in, and has a steel plate that's part of it, and it has another thing, it's an asbestos separator for heat, so heat from the brake doesn't get back into the hydraulic fluid. So what happens is it takes and it makes a stack, which normally is spinning. There's a set of rotors that spin with the tire, okay, that are touched to the wheel, and then there's a part that are stators that stay and don't rotate. So when you squeeze this disc together, it just takes a little bit, like the Corsair is 40 thousandths of space when you do that. Complete, just 40 thousandths is not much. The thick piece of cardboard. The gap closes, and all those discs surface area is what applies friction to make the brake operate. So we got two pairs just because they're hard to find. Eric, I found out after that he has a bunch of these up there at Air Corps, which are available should you be looking for any, and we'll talk about that. On the same side over there on the strut, we've done this. Hi, Eric. Hello. Always stuff in the way. Let me just move a little bit out of our way so you can get an idea. But these landing gear, left and right, is an air oil strut, just like you have on your car, only if really big. They have a little different caveat that there's another section of the strut, and it is used to actually pull this section up in it smaller, similar to what the Corsair or a P-40 does, where it turns. This doesn't turn, they just go up into the wing, okay? But it was a way to make the whole length of this thing shrink up a little bit so it'll fit in the wheel well. So you have a much smaller area. The landing gear strut itself and the trunnion will go out here in this area, and that strut will be in there with the actual tire. So last week I went, here's the Mustang. Hard to talk over a Merlin. So the struts themselves, this one had been compressed. Nothing's leaking. It's all been just sitting here fine, but it was up in here somewhere. That was about all that you could see, is that much little of the silver. So what I did is I put a nitrogen bottle, portable nitrogen bottle we have, and I wanted to see if I could get this to push out with the nitrogen pressure. And about 300, all of a sudden I'm sitting there and it goes shunk, and it did, and nothing leaked. Now we're still going to take this thing on little parts, change all the seals, because they've been sitting for at least 15 years that we know of. I think Brad's going to talk about history of it and oil timings and all that stuff later on, so he'll probably maybe enter into that, how long it's been actually sitting disassembled. But this is the axle and the mounting ring that the brake disc that I just showed you will go on. These are old rusty bearings. We will not be using those. The axle nut itself, I am hunting for 2 P-47 tire rims, at least 2. Always nice to have spares. And tire assembly. So that's on the to find list yet. Once we do that, then we're going to run these things on the bench and make sure that all the seals and everything are not leaking, and we'll put it all back together, and then we're going to get moving on installing in the wings. Okay, the tail wheel is ready to run, doing the same thing, just as a a trial. We'll pull that apart too and change O-rings and all out of it. It's not leaking, and all the plumbing is up in there. It shouldn't take much. We have a little hydraulic mule we can put to it and run it by hand. So that's basically where we are right now, but this wing has been occupying a lot of our time just looking for the parts, and also now we have them. Let's go and get it together and get this thing really rocking and rolling.
So here's the very first question. When Randy is talking and there's a Mustang taking off, was that you?
That was me. They grabbed me. We had a couple of rides that day, and they grabbed me in between the rides, which is why I had my relatively ratty flight suit on instead of my show-off flight suit. So
okay.
They put, we need to talk to you. Come in here. Okay, fine. And then so yeah, that was me.
Very good. Well, you can't, like Randy said, you just can't talk over a Merlin engine, and then
Really
yeah,
can't.
it sounded great. And that's part of the fun of CAF with these aircraft. It's everything from the light liaison aircraft all the way up to the big bombers. There's just a sound that comes from these airplanes, and we are so happy that folks at Airbase Georgia and all of our units around the country continue to share the mission of CAF with folks everywhere, and just remind people about a different period of time, the greatest generation, if you want to call it that, or whatever. But with this particular airplane, it's there's only a couple of P-47s that are actually flying today. I think we did a little research before the show. It was maybe 10 or so, and it's and some of those don't get around very much.
Yes, sir. There's about 10 U.S. registered flying, and when this starts flying, it will be the only P-47N that is still flyable. There are currently no flying P-47N models. The majority were D models, and there were a total of about 15,683 P-47s built. And the majority of the Ds that were built with Razorback canopies instead of the bubble canopies. The bubble canopies were only about 1,800 bubble canopies were built, and then of the ends, which were all bubble canopies, there were about 1,800 of those built. They had a 5,900 on order as of VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day, and they canceled all those orders on VJ Day. Yeah. And so and I think that's something we sometimes lose sight of, is how much stuff was going on and how much production and how the nation was dramatically wound up to produce war material. And the day it was over, it was done. They shut it off. And you talk about a shock to the economy. It had to have been a tremendous shock to the economy. I mean, there was a recession after World War II simply because so much of the economic output had been devoted to war material and, of course, was government spending. It required a significant change. Now, I don't want to get off into politics and economics, but it did lead to a relatively prolonged period of time where things went very stable in the country.
Well, and you talk about that, in 1940, 1941, all production started changing from consumer goods, refrigerators, cars, whatever, into military, and that continued, and that was the thing, is that the miracle of production, that all of these, not only airplanes but ground vehicles and weapons, all these things were being built, and like you said, VJ Day, VE Day, VJ Day, it's like boom, it was done. And I know, having lived in the Dallas area, the North American plant in Grand Prairie was going gangbusters until they cut everything off, and it was like, okay, now what? So yeah,
significant reshuffling of things. It's very dramatic when you read about some of that. I don't know if it's an actual quote, but Hermann Goering, the German air minister, supposedly said early in World War II, said the Americans are pretty good at razor blades and refrigerators, but they can't build airplanes. And I think that was one of the things that came as a shock, was the production. But realistically, one of the things that led to the victory in the war was simply the absolute massive amount of production. The raw materials led to that. Certainly, the factory output and led to that. And while there were issues, and as you read World War II history, you realize that some of the political issues that we have today were political issues that they had then. But these are some things that that occurred. I apologize. My dog suddenly wants all the attention. He went from sleeping to now I want to play. So.
Well, you're talking to somebody else and not to the dog. I understand that.
He's like, wait a minute.
So with the restoration, and this is the burning question, and it's also probably the hardest one to answer. Any idea when the airplane might get back to flying status?
When I first joined Airbase Georgia, back then it was Dixie Wing, the P-63, which you saw the tail of it, is now flyable. It will be going to Oshkosh. It's going to the Reading Air Show. It was in pieces and parts and looked way worse than the P-47 does now. It looked atrocious. And I remember coming out and visiting. I didn't live here then. And going, that thing will never fly. That's a collection of junk. And now it's flying. And so I'm quite optimistic. We have a tremendous number of people who are very talented, both in the actual restoration side, like what Randy and his crew does, but in the machine shop, we have people that can make parts that just do an incredible job of creating what we need. And I've seen them go out there and make the tool to make the part so that things could be done. And that is something that I think is oftentimes not appreciated. I'm very lucky. I get to fly a lot of these airplanes, and it's just a wonderful thing to get to fly it. But on the other hand, the guys that do the restoration, you go out, we have a Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday drill, and we have guys that they show up every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday morning. They go to work just like they had a job. Many of them, as Randy mentioned, are retired Delta mechanics, sheet metal guys, and they are artists, and they get out there and work and do it. But it takes money, it takes time, it takes parts. My guess is that if we're lucky, we'll see it fly in 2 years, but I don't know that. That would be again, you ask for a guess, it's a guess. Anywhere from 2 to 10 years at this point. Frankly, I hope that it flies before I have to quit flying, because I hope I'm lucky enough to get to fly it again. As I said, I'm an airplane addict. My family knows it. They all look at me and roll their eyes. And so, well, Dad, if you didn't have this airplane addiction, but that's, part of the deal.
That's right. If you had to, one of our viewers is asking, if you had to rank your top 3 airplanes, what would they be?
Ooh, top 3. And I would have to say that, the question I would ask with that is, for what purpose? If you're saying, what are the top 3 most fun airplanes to fly? What are the top 3 working airplanes to fly? I've been lucky enough to fly a lot of things. Certainly the Mustang, Corsair are way up on the list. I loved flying the Hawker Sea Fury because it was essentially a later generation. Even though it was World War II, it was a later generation. It was aerodynamically much more well thought out. And as the knowledge base grew, the designers improved as they went through the war. So you even look at the difference between the P-40 and the P-51, tremendous difference. You look at the difference between what the U.S. had as a frontline fighter pre-World War II, biplanes, open cockpit biplanes. By the end of World War II, which was just a scant 6 or 7 years later, they were flying jets. I mean, we had prototype jets flying by the end of World War II, and it was amazing. I mean, the Luftwaffe obviously had functional fighter jets flying by that time, so things were obviously the rate of advance was phenomenal. It was just one of those periods of time where the technology caught up. So you want my 3 favorite airplanes? I always say the one that I like the best is the one somebody else is buying the gas for, but the Corsair, the Mustang certainly are tremendous aircraft that I enjoy all of those. But if you want to talk about a working airplane, an Air Tractor 802 is probably one of the best working airplanes. A traveling airplane, it's hard to beat a King Air 300. There's just a whole lot of neat airplanes out there. The whole thing of aviation is everybody gets to find the part that works for them. And I'm one of the online forums I participate in. People are forever asking, what's the best airplane? Well, it depends on what you want to do with it. How many people do you want to carry? How slow do you want to land? How short of a runway do you want to land on? How fast do you want to go? How much money do you got to spend? One of the things that honestly is tremendous about aviation is there's a spot in there for everybody. And that's one of the things that I love about the CAF. There's a spot in there for everybody. We have people who fly what I would consider the slower airplanes, the airplanes that maybe aren't as well known. And we have some guys that do a tremendous job of demonstrating the PTs, the T6s, the T-34s, some of these airplanes. As I said, I'm lucky. I get to fly the ones that are well known, but I couldn't do it by myself. I'm strictly the lucky person that gets to climb up and do some of that stuff.
And one of the nice things with Airbase Georgia, and this is the third in a series that we've done over the past couple of months on some of your restorations. The PT restoration is one, and you're bringing new people in and teaching some of these almost lost arts, lost art of fabric covering and things that have just sort of fallen by the wayside. And I think that's a tremendous learning experience as well.
It absolutely is. Today, Randy and I, we did some more video today. Today it was a little bit about the Mustang, some about the SBD, and we walked by the PT, and Randy looks at me and he says, "You realize that this was done by people who didn't know anything about this when they started." And there's a mother-daughter combination that has done a tremendous amount of work on the PT. And there's a bunch of other people too. Everybody finds a spot, and that's the thing again that I love about the CAF is there's a spot for everybody, and everybody can find something they like to do. We have guys that very quietly work in the machine shop, don't have to have a lot of contact with people. We have folks like Randy who are great teachers. Randy gets out there and works with people and teaches them how to do everything from fabric work to machine shop work to metal work. We've got a couple of guys that have become eligible to take the airframe and power plant licenses, take the exam to obtain those based on their work at the CAF. They've done so much stuff at the CAF that the FAA has deemed them qualified to take the test. And as anybody who's an A&P mechanic will tell you, the hardest part of getting an A&P mechanics license is getting signed off to take the test. So we've got a lot of cool stuff going on. And we had a lot of cool airplanes like the SBD, which I'm not trying to get off in a rabbit hole, but there's not very many of those flying. Right. We all love the Mustang, but the SBD is extraordinarily historic.
Yeah, and one of it, as you say, with Airbase Georgia, when you think of your inventory, obviously Mustang, Red Nose, the first Mustang that was part of the CAF is still flying today, and the Corsair, of course, those are the two big, I guess, the stars that everyone recognizes. But you're right, the SBD is a fantastic airplane, a great restoration, and it's superb to see that flying at air shows.
Well, as you alluded to, the Red Nose Mustang was the first CAF airplane, and the Corsair followed very soon after that. When the guys at that time down in South Texas said, they're turning these things into beer cans, we need to preserve them, they did. And that's the one thing, to kind of go on a tangent, I'll periodically see somebody say, well, people shouldn't fly those airplanes anymore. And we've even had times when the military would contact us, the CAF, and say, do y'all have some of these airplanes we could put on display? And at least back when Lefty and Lloyd were alive, there tended to be a fairly knee-jerk reaction that said, you guys were tearing these up and you didn't want to let us have them. You wanted to cut them into pieces. I don't think we're going to give you one of them.
Yeah. It is amazing. Just a couple of minutes left in our program tonight. Any final thoughts? What are you looking forward to this summer?
Well, we're going to the Reading Air Show in just a week. The Corsair, Mustang, and the SBD are going. We're looking forward to being able to get out, and one of the things we love doing is giving rides in the Mustang. And we encourage anybody who's interested, look on our website and you can book a ride. And if at the Reading Air Show, I think our rides book is getting very full, but we have rides in the SBD, the T6, the P-51, and it's an opportunity for people to experience the sound, the feel, the sights, and the smells all in one place. But it also supports the airplane. It keeps the organization going. One of the most important things are our volunteers. I simply can't say enough good things about all the people that do all the jobs, everything from the paperwork of keeping up with check rides and medicals and
because we're on a rides program, we have a mandatory drug and alcohol testing, just like the airlines. And we have people that work hard to keep that going. We have people that work hard to keep the maintenance going. It's a huge team effort, and I just am very grateful for all of those folks.
Exactly. Stan, I appreciate you taking time to be with us tonight and sharing your thoughts on flying the P-47, and hope we will see you in the P-47 sometime
Hopefully we
soon.
get to fly that. That's something I'm looking forward to.
All right. Thanks again, and thank you everyone for joining us and sticking around for the program. If you have any thoughts or feedback on our programs, something you'd like to see us cover in future episodes, drop Leah Block an email at media@cafhq.org. Again, thanks to our friends at Airbase Georgia for sharing the update on the restoration of the P-47, and of course Brad Pilgrim for filling us in on the background of not only this P-47 but some of the other P-47s that came on.
Yeah, great job you did.
Yeah. So until next time, thank you for joining us. I'm Steve Buss, and this is CAF Warbird Tube. Have a good night.